All right, so we'll be discussing colonial architecture. This is actually, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, here is the cathedral in Havana, Cuba, that I was able to visit in 2009. That was, no, not 2009, in 2016. Really exciting to have gone and visited. I gave a lecture on this a couple of years ago. Probably, I don't know if any of you were able to attend that. It was probably before you started at the school, but all right, so we're going to start with the age of discovery and exploration, and this is the Western European explorations and colonializations of, well, they do so across the globe, but we're focusing on the Americas, which are discovered in the late 16th century. Um, and Columbus wasn't the the first. We'll talk about Christopher Columbus a little bit, but there were some efforts by Vikings to cross over and discovered Newfoundland and Greenland and so forth. We have pretty good documentation of that now, but there were no permanent settlements or things that happened out of that. So it was really Christopher Columbus and his voyages that launches a massive shift. And this, we're focused on architecture. I'd like to give you some historical background. Obviously there are controversies. There were people here, there were people in not just in the Americas, but the East Indies and Africa and India, Pakistan, all these regions that Europeans traveled to and colonized. There were existing people there, and in most cases, for a long time, they were exploited. Their resources, whether it was gold or silver or timber or furs, whatever you name it, herbs and spices, they were pretty much exploited. The people were exploited in many cases, especially with Africans. They were put into forced servitude, slavery. And moved, all across the world. So, and also the things that, the unintentional consequences, the diseases that Europeans brought to other places, especially to those in the Americas, wiped out entire cultures. And it wasn't intentional. They just the native peoples had no resistance to the diseases that Europeans brought and were devastating to them. And these are the same diseases that would, wipe out large numbers of Europeans at times as well, were even more devastating to Native Americans that had absolutely no resistance or exposure to it. But certainly one of the most important consequential early explorers was Marco Polo. He was a Venetian, and he traveled to China various times between 1271 and 1295. So this is even well before the age of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment era and so forth. But this helped begin to open Europeans' eyes to different cultures and to the spices and herbs that he brought back, and was certainly one of the types of things that leads to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance in Western Europe. Knowledge and understanding and travel is something that we take for granted now, but didn't really exist in the medieval Europe at that time. And these types of events, things like people like Marco Polo and the things he did, helped to change that. His book was widely published in 1300, and and the things he brought back were very inspiring. And so it really began an era of exploration. Other countries who were not involved in the spice trade and didn't have the land links began to think, well, gee, if we could sail ships and make it that way and bring things back by ship, helped to lead to the explorations that went largely around the Horn of Africa, but that was a long journey. And so, eventually in the late 1500s, Christopher Columbus said, what if, I think we can make it by going, just west across the globe. And Columbus, again, I know he's a controversial figure now, but he had the idea. There's sometimes this mythology that everybody thought the world was flat before Christopher Columbus. That really wasn't true. Anyone with an education, and I realize that was a small number of people in the world at the time, but anyone with an education knew that the Earth was a sphere and was completely round. Certainly, those in antiquity knew it as well. There's documentation now that I think Greek or scholars or something actually had a pretty close estimate to the diameter of the planet even back then. Um, but the question was really how big was our globe, and if you began to sail west instead of going down around the Horn of Africa, could you reach Asia? Could you reach the East Indies and the spices and the riches that were there and bring things back more quickly that way? Columbus thought you could. And in fact, he died thinking that you could. He never understood that he'd never reached the East Indies, that he had reached an entirely new continent. And that explains why we call Native Americans Indians and why we call the islands of the Caribbean the West Indies, because of that belief that he had reached the East Indies, Malaysia and Indonesia, that region that we call them now. So here's just a map of some of his explorations. He made 4 voyages, the first shown in blue, which he reached essentially the modern day islands of Cuba and Santo Domingo, returned successfully and said, hey, guess what I found? Again, he mistakenly thought he found the East Indies, or at least an archipelago of them, and he discovered these people and some things there, and got um, uh, money to make return voyages, and we see several of those exploring numerous of the Caribbean islands, and eventually on his 4th voyage actually making it to the mainland of Central America today before returning. He was sponsored by the Spanish crown. He was an Italian, Columbus, but he was actually funded by the Spanish, who had just recently completed their reconquest of the Spanish peninsula and the consolidation of power on their entire peninsula. And this was something that he convinced them to do, and actually wound up providing immense riches for the Spanish crown because of eventually the gold and silver that would be found. Yes, German, you had a question?
Yeah, so before the Spaniards like reoccupied the peninsula, was it ruled by the Moors?
Yes, that's correct. So the Moors were the Islamic group that had come across North Africa, invaded and occupied most of the Iberian Peninsula in modern day Portugal and Spain. And then slowly, over several centuries, the sort of Spanish Catholics, they called it the Reconquista. The winners get to pick the names of things, so they called it the Reconquista. And we talked about the Mezquita in Cordoba and the Alhambra in Granada as being just incredible works of architecture by the Moors. That was finished ironically, in 1492, the same year that they, hired Columbus to do his explorations. It was the same year they completely pushed out the Moors. So this is actually a photo. We'll talk later about the Columbian Exposition in Chicago from 1893. But I like this photo from that because they built a replica of the Nina and the Pinta, and the third was the Santa Maria, the 3 ships that Columbus used. And I like this because these are actual full-scale replications of 2 of the ships that he sailed on this first journey. And you can see the people standing on the dock. These were not big boats. It took an immense amount of bravery or stupidity or both to get on a little wooden ship like that and sail across the ocean. I like seeing that because it really shows you the incredible effort that it took to do that. And in fact, one of his ships sank, pretty early in the voyage. And it was not unusual for these ships to sink. All it took was a storm, certainly a hurricane, and these ships would be gone. And so his feat and the others that did this are actually pretty incredible. So this map here shows you the world, the exploration, various explorations of the world. This sort of greenish color is the extent of the Spanish colonialization. The orangey color is the Portuguese, who were also major explorers. They started out going around the Horn of Africa, and so you see a lot of orange Portuguese territories in Africa and India. A little bit, of course, Brazil was a Portuguese colony, and they still speak Portuguese down in Brazil. The rest of South America, Central America speak Spanish because of the Spanish colonialization. And the Portuguese were the first to begin, enslaving Africans and taking them to the New World as labor. We see some of the different figures, Vasco da Gama and Magellan. Magellan was the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe. You see this blue line. Magellan himself didn't make it. He was killed by natives somewhere in the East Indies over here. But his rest of his crew and some of his ships made it all the way around the globe the first time somebody did that. This is a statue of Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian, and he is famous. He was another explorer, and he went up and down the coastline of the American continents, and ultimately his name, Amerigo, was sort of tweaked a little bit and became the root of North and South America. The two new continents. He was one of the first to fully understand that these were new continents, and so therefore that knowledge stuck with his name for what we would call them now. Here's just an old rendering showing, a very romanticized view of Amerigo Vespucci encountering Native Americans in modern-day Honduras. They all look very fun and peaceful and all that, and of course that's not really what ultimately would happen. So I want to talk a little bit about the colonial architecture and settlement in Cuba. One of the first areas to be colonized in the Americas, a very large island just off the coast of Florida. And this begins after 1511. We start to see actual Spanish colonies being founded. And on this map here, Havana is over on the western side. This is an early map. I forget the exact date on this, but probably from the 1500s. Havana, the city, would be founded over here on the left side. And we're going to start talking about Trinidad, which is, I believe, right here, and is one of the first Spanish colonial settlements on the sort of mid-south coast of modern Cuba. This was founded in 1514. So if you think 1492 was Columbus's first voyage, we're talking about 20 years, and we're already starting to see colonial settlements. It was a sugar plantation hub. The territory around Trinidad was very rich for sugarcane, and this was one of the natural resources that the Europeans fell in love with, who doesn't like sugar, and began to grow on plantations because the native peoples were dying out due to the illnesses that were brought in. Very quickly, the Spanish began to bring in Africans to work these plantations. There's a very significant African population in Cuba today. So these are some images of Trinidad, which is kind of died off in the 19th century. It was sort of cut off from major roads and so forth, and just sort of floundered, which was very bad for the people living there for a long time, but means that the city didn't get destroyed and rebuilt over time. And so you can visit Trinidad today and really see what a early Spanish colonial settlement looks like. These are my photos from my visit there in 2016. You see on the right there's a colonial church. We'll talk more about churches here briefly, but we see some kind of architectural traditions that we were seeing in Europe. We see a Roman arched loggia here on the right, and it's a little hard to tell, but there's a loggia walkway or arcade behind this, and in the very hot, sun of the Mediterranean, or not Mediterranean, the Caribbean. You want this protection, from the intense sunlight if you're walking around in this arcade. We see some projecting balconies, also with roofs over top of them to help provide some shade and shelter. Here's another view of a typical street in Trinidad. We see very, tile roofs. We see very large window openings. I think this next photo will show this a little better. This is a house we were able to visit. It's a museum space now. Actually, no, it's not a museum. I think it's more like an Airbnb. We were able to gain access. This woman here is actually the preservation planner for Trinidad, and she was giving us a tour. But you can see, look at the large windows and doorways here. And this, and these are modern iron grills. I think in the photo behind, let me see. One of these, here's some wooden grills here, and these were for protection because of such large window openings. You throw those open and somebody could just easily walk inside and steal your things. So they would put up these, wooden grill work, and then over, in later centuries, it became more just iron work. But that, is a defensive, protective element here. But that still allows you to open these doors to let in lots of ventilation and whatever airflow you can get on hot Caribbean days. But the outside is pretty traditional. It's just stuccoed. There's a tile roof, nothing too fancy other than these, these large windows. But on the inside, we still see elements of European Renaissance neoclassical type of architecture here. Roman archways with a little bit of molding and trim, not quite any pilasters and so forth in here, but some tile floors and just an exposed wooden ceiling. This is really typical of early Spanish colonial architecture, and this would have been a home for, a relatively middle class type of family here. This was not a wealthy home. It wasn't, a tenement either for those who were living in poverty. But this example is this is a mansion. This would have been one of the sugar barons. Also dating from the 16th century, and this is the interiors, really ornate, very massive, very, very tall ceilings. These tall ceilings were typical in Spanish colonial architecture because the hot air that was typical in this region would rise up, and it would help keep things cooler down low. And the ceilings were kept open. If you look on the right, you see the exposed wood ceiling. They didn't finish it off with, a flat plaster ceiling because that would have trapped that hot air. By leaving it open, even between rooms, that air can circulate around. And if you open the doors and windows, like you see on the far left, you see one of these massive, windows is now open. That helps air circulate through and around in the space because they don't have air conditioning, right? They don't have fans that are running, so they can only use the natural air circulation of breezes and airflow that can exist. But yeah, you see on the left is these, an example of these massive windows. You can just sort of make out the iron bars that were installed on here, but these are bigger than the doors we think of today, and this is just a window. So that's part of the adaptation that's occurring in colonial architecture to get as much light and ventilation as they possibly can. The other thing I want to point out is that even though this is a very wealthy family's home, the details are mostly trompe-l'oeil. And if you're familiar with trompe-l'oeil, that basically means, sort of a faux design. We've talked about that. We talked about that with Alberte and that church where he did the trompe-l'oeil altar vault behind the altar where it was flat. And this is the same thing. This mantle, this very traditional Renaissance entablature over the doorway is fake. You know, that shadow is fake. That's all painted into the flat plaster. Much of the decoration is painted into the flat plaster. And that was, you know, even though this was a wealthy family, this is an island that is, you know, weeks away by sailing ship, and you're not even guaranteed to make it. The ship might sink in a storm or because it springs a leak or something. And so, you know, they only really have the resources that exist on the island. Whether that's craftspersons, materials, you know, they don't have rich marbles that they have in Italy and in Spain, and so they recreate that with the resources they have, which is, you know, people painting this into wet plaster. Here's another view. The courtyard on the right is an open courtyard, around of which would have been kitchens and servant spaces. This would have been a place where they, you know, would have had a fountain for fresh water. They could have grown, you know, herbs and plants for, you know, using in food and so forth. On the left is an image of one of the bedrooms, you know, with an iron bed. That's a little later than the house itself, but again, a lot of the decoration looks like fancy marbling and detailing, almost Baroque-like what we were seeing in Baroque architecture, but it's all fake, you know, fresco plastered trompe l'oeil. Same thing with this pediment over the doorway on the far left. That's all fake plaster. Again, because that's all they could, you know, reasonably use and construct at this time. All right, so that's Trinidad. Havana was founded in 1519 and soon became the capital of this new colony that and Cuba wound up being a key colony because it was the largest island in the archipelago there of the Caribbean. And so it was easy, and it was kind of a stopping off point. And Havana had a fantastic harbor that, you know, was safe and protected, easily protected against pirates and against the French and the English, and also safe from storms. You can make it into the harbor and your ship would be okay during a hurricane or a storm. And so, you know, even in later generations, when they were colonizing Mexico and Central America, the ships would usually stop and start in Cuba, which meant there was incredible amount of wealth, especially in Havana, the main port for Cuba, because of that. It was a central trade point. So here is a map. This map dates from 1740, so really a couple centuries after the founding of Havana, but still showing you a good view of colonial Havana. So here in red is the extent of the city at that time, and you can even make out the city walls with the little battlements, you know, that surround it, and the very natural harbor. So they could protect the harbor with two forts right here on the entrance to the inlet, and then once your ship came in, you were pretty protected against, you know, rough seas and storms and so forth. And so Havana really became the major Spanish colonial city, both in Cuba and one of the most major cities in all of the Spanish colonies. And Old Havana today still is pretty intact. There's different neighborhoods of Havana that you know, come from later eras, but there's still a pretty intact uh, Spanish colonial architecture here. This is another 1700s rendering of one of the main plazas of Havana here. You can see there would have been a public water fountain. There would have been these arcades, again, Roman arches mostly, like we were seeing in the Renaissance. So they're taking the architecture and they're bringing it with them. This is the architecture that they know. The builders and the designers that might come across and find a new, you know, life and career in this new world are bringing the architectural traditions that they know of. And so we're seeing very much a Renaissance and Baroque architecture in the Spanish colonies because that's what was popular at this time. This is my photo from the plaza for the cathedral. There were, I think there's 4 or 5 main plazas in Old Town Havana. So that was one. This is another one. This is a standing in front of the cathedral, looking at some of the buildings surrounding it, and you see they're it's a wealthy enough community, and the resources for stone were available. So they began building some of the grand buildings in stone. They could bring stone carvers over and give them plenty of work building these new cities. But we're seeing Roman arched loggias with classical, Doric order colonnades, just like we were seeing in the Renaissance architecture in earlier lectures. This view is the governor's palace. This is built a little later in the 1700s, and so it's a little more of a Baroque style building, which again we see, the Renaissance foundations of that. Here's a Doric order, even with an entablature of some triglyphs and metopes. We see the Roman arched arcade with a deep arcade inside to walk and be sheltered from the harsh environment. But it's partly Baroque, and you can see that a little bit on the above the second floor windows, where we begin to see a lot of ornamentation and sort of curvature and a fluffy, foofy ornament that is pretty typical. This is another plaza outside. To the right is, you can see the tree is an open square of greenery. And you can even see the building beyond. It again has a Roman arched colonnade to it. The cathedral is definitely a Baroque style building. This dates from 1748, finished in 1777, and would have been a rebuilding. There would have been a cathedral here. I don't know whether it burned or whether they wanted to build something bigger and grander. It's built in stone. This is the same plaza I showed you before. Now we're looking the opposite direction. So you see on the right and left are the arcaded stone loggias of the buildings surrounding the plaza, and then the church here at the center. And I'm hoping that you see right away that this is very much a Baroque style building. It has the curves and the decoration that ought to reveal to you very quickly how Baroque this is. And if I show you I zoom in a little bit, we talked about a building like this in Rome from really a couple century or about a century earlier. And that points out too a little bit that sometimes the styling of the New World is often a little bit behind the trends that are happening in Europe, and that's of course, you can say the same thing even in the modern world, where in the Midwest, the style centers are right around the coast, the East Coast and the West Coast, and LA and New York or whatever, and then it takes a few years maybe for those popular styles to make it to the Midwest. On a sort of longer scale, you have the same thing happening in this colonial era, in which it takes weeks to travel across the ocean. And so, and people aren't flooding over, in mass. We don't have internet connections and phones and so forth. So, new builders, new designers aren't coming over very quickly, and they're so for generations you might have these older builders and architects still working in the styles that they had learned back in the old world several decades ago. So this very Baroque cathedral here from the mid 1700s is definitely a century old. But if we compare that to San Carlo al Quattro Fontane by Borromini, we can see hopefully that direct connection between the New World Baroque and the Old World Baroque. So remember, this was a flat facade or flat front, but they curve. Borromini curves this, and these contrasting convex and concave curvatures and the ornamentation all over the front of the building make this a Baroque architectural style. And we see a similar approach here with the cathedral in Havana. All right, so soon after, not too long after the colonization of Cuba takes place, and they've sort of cemented their control over the island of Cuba, they began to look out beyond and say, okay, now where do we go? What's next? And Mexico, the modern day country of Mexico, is sort of next on their list, or the next big one on their list. And so we start to see the origins of Spanish colonial in Mexico in 1519. And this is started by the conquistador Hernan Cortez. Here we see him here in his battle armament, looking very pious. He like many of the figures we've talked about in history, he, you know, he was not as pious in reality as he might have been in his in church, but he could be a pretty brutal. You needed to be if you were going to conquer a people. So his claim to fame, of course, is defeating the Aztec Empire, which was the prominent um, uh, political organization of peoples in present-day Mexico, with their capital city of Tenochtitlan, which he conquered between 1519 and 1521. And that became the new capital of Spanish colonial empire in the Americas, and they renamed it Mexico City. Mexico, or the Mextica, were the people that the Aztecs considered themselves. And so, very early on, the Spanish and other colonists sort of adapted and adopted names and places of the indigenous peoples, even though they were, pushing them out and completely destroying things in their conquests. So here, this is a famous scene that when Cortez landed with his troops on the coast of Mexico, he burned his ships, purposely burned them. And that was a message to his troops that they were in for the long haul, that there was no retreat. They were not going to, face a little resistance and turn around, get back on their ships and leave, that they were going to conquer or die, I guess you could say. The Aztec people were a formidable enemy. To be sure, and there weren't large numbers of soldiers coming. They had some unique armor and weapons that the native peoples didn't, but they were massively outnumbered, and so it was not a foreordained conclusion that the Spanish would win this essentially war. And they actually brought on many native peoples as allies, people who were the longtime enemies of the Aztecs, and they used them as sort of grunt soldiers to help them in their battles and wars against the Aztecs. But interestingly, the conquest of the Aztecs happened more through one might say negotiations, another might say deceit. Initially, Cortez was welcomed by the ruler Montezuma as a sort of potential guest and friend, and treated well. And in return, in one of his visits, Cortez basically had his troops suddenly capture Montezuma and take him prisoner, and then use him as a bargaining tool for the rest of the city to surrender, because of the difficulty they would have had of trying to conquer the city by force. So the first thing architecturally I want to talk about with Mexico is the actual city plan for what will become Mexico City. This occurs in 1521, soon after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, and the planner for this is Alonso Garcia Bravo. And so some of you may recall from the fall semester, we talked about Tenochtitlan as the heart of the Aztec Empire. This graphic here shows that it sat on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and surrounded by some farmland and then by mountains around it. It would have been very difficult to try to conquer this, because the city was connected by these causeways, and all the defenders had to do was cut off the causeways, and they were basically protected on an island, and it would have been very difficult for an invading army to conquer them. And that's partly why Cortez had to use essentially deceit to do that. And I think I show this in the fall semester as well, this description by one of the conquistadors in Cortez's party describing the city of Tenochtitlan. He was really impressed what a massive organized city this was. And they weren't really used to seeing this. Even in this time, most of European cities were still, I'm going to use a nasty term, shitholes. I mean, they were, people were dumping their waste into the streets. The buildings, we talked about great buildings of the Renaissance and Baroque era, but most of the rest of it were, rundown tenements that barely gave people a decent place to live. And so they were pretty impressed by this. Didn't stop them from tearing it down, I guess, but it still shows you the culture was incredibly rich here, and that they had one of the most major cities in the world at the time. Here's another view of Tenochtitlan. At the heart of the city on the island was their main plaza, and this was where they had their temples and their ceremonial sites. Which, of course, one of the things the Spanish did almost right away on their conquering of any people was to try to convert them into Catholicism. They saw this as an absolute necessity. They were very strong believers that these people's souls would be saved if they could be converted to Catholicism and Christianity. And if they resisted and they were burned at the stake or killed or something like that, they saw that as worth it. Again, this is we see things differently in our approach to different cultures and religions, but at this time it was seen as an absolute necessity to convert these people to Catholicism and to Christianity. So here's a plan again of the city of Tenochtitlan. The temple complex would have been right at the heart of it, and you see all the causeways that connect it. Now the modern city of Mexico takes up the entire lake bed. The lake has been drained and it sits on this old lake bed, which is a problem when they have earthquakes, actually, but that's a whole nother story. So here is essentially the plan that Alonso Bravo creates in 1521. So he doesn't completely bulldoze the city where people are living, and the native peoples that aren't dying from disease are still inhabiting the city and would continue to do so. And so largely he leaves their neighborhoods intact. We see all these green areas here, but he transforms the plaza, which had been where the pagan temples and ritual sites like the ball court that we talked about in the fall. All of those are now converted into, a Catholic church, a cathedral, and into a palace for the governor, and a main public plaza. Number one here listed, it becomes the Plaza Mayor, the major plaza, and surrounding that, item 2 is the cathedral. Item 4 is the palace that Cortez will occupy, and then later governors, and it still remains as the presidential palace for the modern state of Mexico. Other important buildings surround this central plaza, and symbolically, these are built on top of the pagan temples. So it's replacing, physically and symbolically, it's replacing these pagan temples with Christian sites and with Spanish sites, and in many cases they used the stone and repurposed it to build the churches and the palaces. So here is a very early drawing of the Plaza Mayor. On the left is where the new church or cathedral will be built, and on the top is where the palace will be built. And you can see surrounding it are colonnades. These aren't arched, these don't have Roman arches, they're just straightforward temple front type colonnades with entablatures and walls above that. So very much a sort of Renaissance / Baroque aesthetic here. This was a graphic, I think I showed that in the fall. So at the bottom is an image of the old pagan temples of Tenochtitlan, and then on the top is the Plaza Mayor built on that, with the cathedral replacing the Temple of the Sun here. And here's another early rendering. This is from 1692, showing the Plaza Mayor at that time. On the left is the cathedral. You can just make that out. In the distance is the still partially completed um, uh, governor's palace. We can see a main entrance portal here, and we can see pretty intact wing over here on the left, and on the right is still under construction. It hasn't been completed yet. And on the far right, along this side of the plaza, we see a little bit of that colonnade arcade that existed, we saw in that plan in the earlier slide. It is a massive plaza. Here's a contemporary view of it. So on the left, you see one of the towers of the cathedral. The governor's palace is here, sort of in the background, and you can still see, colonial era architecture surrounding the plaza and just how massive this space is. And that gives you a sense of how massive the original plaza was of Tenochtitlan. Again, they basically just tore down the pagan buildings and the ball courts and so forth that were on there, and they rebuilt mostly on the same sites, the cathedral and the palace. So this would have been a massive open plaza where the people of the city could have gathered in Aztec times, and then in Spanish colonial times, and as you can see here, even in modern era of the nation of Mexico. So a couple of the specific examples I was referring to, first the National Palace. This was started in 1521, and largely a major element was finished by 1530 by Rodrigo de Pontoquillos and Juan Rodriguez, and then later added on and expanded in the 1690s by Friar Diego Valverde. So again, here's a front view from the plaza, and we were seeing this element here in those earlier renderings. So this was part of the work that was done early on, and to the left was largely completed in the 1520s. And this would have been, again, the palace for the first governor, Hernan Cortez, and then later governors that came in after him. And then later expansions essentially keep the same architectural tradition that were going on the right that we were seeing in that rendering that was still under construction in the 1690s. If we look at it a little bit closer here, we see some elements of the Renaissance. We see a base that is really more typical of what we were seeing in early Renaissance in the palazzos in Florence, where there weren't big windows and openings along the ground floor, and that was somewhat of a defensive mechanism to prevent people from easily gaining access into your palace. The same thing applied to the governor's palace. They did not want the native peoples, getting on, causing unrest and maybe easily gaining access into the palace. And so the ground floor is largely more fortified with a solid stone wall and smaller windows raised up. But then on the upper floors, you see the larger window openings with somewhat classical entablatures over the top of them, and even Roman arched windows along the very top. But the entryway that you can see here is, and here especially, is actually essentially a Baroque style entrance. You see a lot more ornamentation and decoration. You can see all the curvatures of the forms here on the top of the parapet wall of these entrance pavilions, and that makes those a Baroque style, which it was becoming popular by the 1500s and certainly in the 1600s. On the inside, we can see a large courtyard. This is a massive building, and so we have large inner courtyards. And these also are very typical of the kind of Renaissance architecture of the palazzo that we were talking about, the Palazzo Medici and the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. We have on the ground floor, we have Roman arched arcades with a loggia that people can walk and circulate in the exterior because this is a temperate climate. On the upper facades, we see windows encased in stone entablatures and pilasters on the windows here. the Spanish would have spared no expense building the royal palace here. So this is a grander building than what might have been typical of the time, but was, would become the norm as you had more wealth and more established people building architecture in the city. The other example from Mexico City I want to talk about is the cathedral. This date started in 1573. It was added on over time, largely completed in the 16th century, but with additions and alterations going all the way into the early 1800s. The primary architect from the beginning was Claudio de Arciniega. Obviously he didn't live this long, but he was the initial architect or designer for this. So here we see a view of the cathedral from the plaza. Some of the later additions are here on the right, but the main facade is this element on the left here. And again, we're seeing a combination of essentially Renaissance architecture with introductions of the Baroque. We have, pilasters. Look at the scrolls at the tops of some of these pilasters. These are the scrolls that we were seeing with Alberti at Santa Maria Novella. We have, classical entablatures. Here we have a sort of circular entablature. The towers are relatively Renaissance. We're not seeing a lot of the curved forms and the heavy ornamentation that we would see with the Baroque. Certainly the entry portal on the right is more Baroque style. It's heavily ornamented, that Chiriguaresque style that we talked about a little bit when I talked about Spanish Baroque architecture. Here is an early rendering view of the Plaza Mayor with the cathedral shown in the background there. We can see it does have a dome at the crossing. A pretty typical Renaissance Baroque thing to do is to have a dome. And Mexico City, being the primary Spanish colonial capital with a lot of wealth, meant that they could build a grand cathedral like this. Here is this is the very entrance way. So again, this is more Renaissance. In the 1570s, we're really still in the Renaissance era and not fully into the Baroque yet. So, we have a Doric order on the base with triglyphs and metopes. We got the Ionic order above that, and then yet another colonnade at the very top. So, and a Roman arched entryway. Very much a Renaissance architecture that the architects coming across, this is what they knew. This is the stone carvers. They knew how to do this. When we go inside, over time they would make alterations, and so the what is known as the retablo, the altar element behind the altar, you can see the altar down here at the bottom, is a Baroque style. This is something similar to what Bernini had been doing at St. Peter's, very gilded. There was a lot of gold and silver mined out of Mexico that helped enrich the Spanish crown and the Spanish colonies. And so this is just covered in gilding. It's one of the most incredibly decorative altar pieces in all of the Americas. Here is another one in a different chapel, the Altar of Forgiveness, with also just a completely gilded retablo behind this altar here. Okay, so some of you will be talking a little more about other elements of Spanish colonial. I'm going to cover the Spanish colonial architecture in New Mexico and Arizona. These are now the two southwestern states in the United States, but these started as Spanish colonies and were early Spanish colonies, especially in Nuevo Mexico, which ironically was called Mexico before Mexico was Mexico. The state of Mexico was in 1821, founded in 1821. Well, New Mexico existed even before that, even though it's the new part. And Arizona, is the modern state just west of New Mexico. The first colonization started, or exploration started, in 1540 by Vasquez de Coronado, a conquistador. Here you can see in red was his trek further south. Here, down somewhere in here, would be Mexico City. So he strikes out with a caravan and soldiers, comes up a little bit in eastern Arizona, discovers, the Acoma Pueblo and some of the pueblos that exist along the Rio Grande River in New Mexico, and eventually made himself all the way into the Great Plains. He wound up in central Kansas, and finally turned around. He was looking for cities of gold. The Spanish had found a amount of gold and silver in Mexico, as I've mentioned, and they heard there was even more. If they hadn't had enough, they're like, "Oh my God, there's cities of gold in this territory," and they believed that. They had no reason not to, and so. Coronado leads this exposition. He's going to find all these golden cities, and they literally thought that they were entire towns and pueblos built out of gold. He was quite disappointed, and most likely these came from stories. This is a view of Acomo Pueblo, one of the oldest pueblos in the Americas, or at least in North America and present-day United States. And on top of this mesa here, and you can't really quite make it out, is the town. And they were built out of adobe. It was just adobe construction, but the natural clays of this region have mica in it, and mica is kind of a shiny. Sometimes it's silvery, sometimes it's gold colored, and it's shiny and reflective. And the mica flakes that would be in the clay that they would build their pueblos out of, in the right kind of sunlight, would sparkle and reflect, and they might look to a visitor from a distance like this as it might be made out of gold or silver. And so these stories get passed along. It's like the telephone game. So someone said, someone said, someone said. By the time it made its way to Mexico City, they were convinced that these were cities of gold, and they were pretty disappointed to find out that it was just clay adobe. Here's a aerial view of the Acoma Pueblo. This is one of the oldest, like I say, one of the oldest cities in the United States today. It's still inhabited by the Acoma people, the native peoples here. You can see the Pueblo, adobe pueblos here on top of the mesa, and this is the church that the Spanish built. So Coronado didn't really colonize New Mexico. It was later the conquistador Juan de Onate, but he came back. He conquered Acoma and the other pueblos, and we started seeing mission churches built by the Spanish to convert the natives to Catholicism. Here is my photo from a visit to Acoma. These are the clay buildings that still exist. They have modern windows and doors and staircases instead of the more traditional ladders, but the houses still have their roots in buildings dating back to 1100 CE, well long before the Spanish arrived, well before the Americans arrived from the United States. And this is the Spanish colonial church, Mission San Esteban del Rey. This was built by the Spanish, starting in 1629, finished in 1641. And this was typical. This was built out of adobe. This was the material they had. There were no trees. This is the desert of New Mexico, so there are very few trees. There's no, stone. There's plenty of stone, but it takes a lot of craftsmanship to build out of stone. But what was plentiful is dirt. And you can make adobe out of dirt and build very quickly and very easily. You can build churches. And if you want to convert these people quickly, you can do so by building adobe churches. This is my photo on my first visit here many years ago. And it's one of my favorite photos ever because these two little kids here on the bottom left are just adorable in this kind of silhouette. And it gives you a sense of the scale. This was a big church. Acoma was one of the most primary pueblos of the era. The Spanish colony was founded by Pedro de Peralta. He was the first governor of Nuevo Mexico, and they founded a capital city in Santa Fe. The actual name is much longer, but it's been shortened to Santa Fe, which translates as Holy Faith. It was founded in 1610 long before the America was founded in 1776, and even only a couple of years after the Jamestown colony. So if you really want, people talk about the history of colonial America on the East Coast, and it's all great, but there's even more history and rich history and cultures in the American Southwest, especially in New Mexico. So the Palace of the Governors was built, and this, excuse me, in 1610, this remains the oldest public building in America, in the United States, that is. So here it is. This is a modern view of it. It's been altered over time and recreate or restored and rebuilt a more view of as it would have looked in 1610. Again, it's mostly built out of adobe. This is what is plentiful as a construction material in the northern New Mexico where Santa Fe is, and they use just simple wooden posts for the arcade. It's still a Renaissance style building, really. It's got a colonnade and an arcade or loggia like we were seeing in the Renaissance in Florence, in Rome. It's just they don't have the materials, they don't have the wealth, they don't have the craftsmen in 1610 in New Mexico to build like we saw in Florence and in Rome and in Mexico City. And so this is a much simpler, but the form is there. The wood logs that make up the ceiling beams, these are called vigas, and they stick out off the end here because, again, to finish these off and to carve them and do something fancy would have taken a lot of effort, a lot of craftsmanship that simply didn't exist in this early colony in 1610. Here's another view of it with the Spanish colonial flag, and you can see that they did create a capital. It's kind of a ionic capital to these column heads with the little scrolls and curves on them, but they just don't have the talent here at this time to create a true ionic order column. But they're trying. They're doing their best of what they have available. And then this is a view of the arcade. This is in regular times, this is a very popular place where Native American artists bring and they can lay out a blanket with their jewelry or their pottery or other artwork that they create. And this has been occurring almost since the beginning, or at least since tourists began coming in the early 20th century. And Native people, artisans, realize, hey, I can sell my artwork to people directly. And so it's a very popular marketplace. But in older times, in colonial era times, you would have had this would have been a marketplace for vendors selling, fruits and vegetables and corn or pottery to cook in, something more functional rather than decorative to put on your fireplace mantle. So this has been continuously used for these purposes since 1610. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop for today.